During decades, the archives military maintained this story in total sigillo. No soldier who participated wanted to speak about what really happened that night in Italy. But today, you are going to discover the reason. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. And if you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel for more daily documentaries. Ready? Now turn up the volume and let's begin. The sun was setting over the Serchio Valley in northern Italy on that cold December day in 1944. The snow had been falling steadily for hours, covering the rugged terrain in a pristine white blanket that would soon be stained with blood. Captain James Hartford of the 370th Infantry Regiment, 92nd Division, looked through his binoculars at the German positions on the opposite ridge. The Buffalo soldiers of the 92nd had been in combat for 4 months now, fighting their way up the Italian peninsula against fierce German resistance. But tonight would be different. Tonight would change the course of the war in this sector, though the full story would not emerge for decades. The military intelligence report that arrived that morning was marked highest priority and stamped with the seal of the 5th Army headquarters. Inside was information that would alter the fate of an entire battalion. German Field Marshal Albert Kesselring had reorganized his forces along this section of the Gothic Line, bolstering defenses with veterans of the 16th SS Panzergrenadier Division. More concerning was the intercepted communication suggesting that the Germans were planning a major counter-offensive, targeting what they perceived as the weakest link in the Allied line. The positions held by the African-American troops of the 92nd Infantry Division. Captain Hartford folded the intelligence report and placed it inside his jacket pocket. The German assessment stung, but it wasn't surprising. Since arriving in Italy in August of 1944, the Buffalo soldiers had faced not only the enemy, but also the skepticism of their own military leadership. General Edward Almond, their division commander, made no secret of his doubts about their combat effectiveness. And now, the Germans seemed to share this assessment, viewing the black soldiers as the path of least resistance for their planned breakthrough. What the intelligence report didn't mention, what nobody could have known, was that the Germans had severely miscalculated. Their assessment was based on racial prejudice rather than battlefield reality. The men of the 92nd Division had proven themselves repeatedly in combat, despite being given the most difficult assignments and receiving the least support. They had fought across the Arno River, liberated towns, and held their positions against determined German counterattacks. But in the eyes of many, they remained untested, unproven, and underestimated. Hartford gathered his officers in an abandoned farmhouse that served as their command post. Lieutenant William Thompson, a tall man from Harlem who had been a schoolteacher before the war, spread a map across the table. Sergeant Major Isaiah Washington, whose grandfather had served with the original Buffalo soldiers in the Indian Wars, stood nearby, his experienced eyes scanning the tactical situation. Also present was Lieutenant Marcus Baldwin, a fair-skinned man from Philadelphia whose mixed ancestry allowed him to move between worlds, a skill that had proven useful on reconnaissance missions. "Gentlemen," Hartford began, his voice steady despite the gravity of the situation, "German command believes we are the weak point. They're preparing to hit us with everything they've got, likely within the next 48 hours. They expect us to break and run." He paused, looking at each man in turn. "We're going to prove them wrong, but we're going to do more than that. We're going to turn their prejudice against them." The plan that emerged over the next hour was audacious, perhaps even foolhardy, but if it worked, it would not only blunt the German offensive, but potentially create an opening for an Allied advance. The key was to make the Germans believe their assessment was correct, that the Buffalo soldiers were indeed unprepared and vulnerable, only to spring a devastating trap when the enemy committed their forces. As the officers discussed the details, Sergeant Washington spoke up. "Sir, my men will hold their positions no matter what. They've been doing it since we landed, despite what anyone thinks of them. But this plan, it's asking a lot." Hartford nodded. "It is, Sergeant, but I have complete faith in our men. The Germans are counting on us to behave according to their prejudices. They're expecting fear, disorganization, panic. Instead, they'll find discipline, courage, and a nasty surprise." The men departed to brief their platoons, leaving Hartford alone with his thoughts. He knew the risks. If the plan failed, the blame would fall squarely on the shoulders of the black soldiers, regardless of the circumstances. Success, on the other hand, might still be attributed to luck or the failings of the enemy rather than the skill and bravery of his men. This was the reality they had fought under since arriving in the European theatre. Every failure magnified, every success diminished. As darkness fell, the Buffalo Soldiers began their preparations. Under the cover of night, the 370th Regiment strategically weakened certain sections of their front line, creating what appeared to be gaps in their defenses. Artillery pieces were repositioned, ammunition stockpiled, and communications established with neighboring units. Every man knew his role and understood the stakes. They were not just fighting for territory or tactical advantage, they were fighting to prove something that should never have needed proving in the first place: their worth as soldiers and as men. Miles away, in an elegant villa requisitioned as a headquarters, General Major Werner Rutherford of the 16th SS Panzer Grenadier Division studied his own maps. A career officer who had fought on both the Eastern and Western fronts, Rutherford had survived this long by being methodical and unsentimental. The upcoming offensive was well planned, with overwhelming force directed against what intelligence indicated was the most vulnerable section of the American line. "These Negro troops," he remarked to his staff officers, "lack the discipline and fighting spirit of proper soldiers. Our reconnaissance indicates poor defensive positions, lax security protocols, and low morale. They will break quickly under pressure." The officers nodded in agreement, having been fed a steady diet of propaganda about racial inferiority since long before the war. Oberstleutnant Heinrich Keller, Rutherford's operations officer, pointed to several locations on the map. "We have identified their artillery positions here and here. Our preliminary bombardment will target these areas first, followed by concentrated attacks on these three sectors. Intelligence suggests these are manned by their least experienced companies." "And our objective once the breakthrough is achieved?" asked a young lieutenant, recently arrived from officer training in Germany. "We push through to the coastal road," Rutherford replied. "If successful, we will have split the American Fifth Army in two, isolating their forward elements and forcing a major withdrawal. Berlin is very interested in a significant victory in this sector. It would demonstrate that our defensive strategy in Italy remains sound despite setbacks elsewhere." What neither Rutherford nor his staff knew was that much of their intelligence had been carefully crafted and allowed to fall into German hands. The artillery positions they had identified were largely decoys. The supposedly inexperienced companies were in fact some of the most battle-hardened units in the regiment, and the apparent gaps in the American lines were killing zones, pre-sighted for artillery and machine gun fire. The night before the attack, a light snow began to fall again, further obscuring the landscape and the preparations on both sides. In the American lines, Captain Hartford made his final inspections. The men were in position, tense but ready. Many had written letters home just in case. Others cleaned their weapons repeatedly, finding comfort in the familiar routine. A few prayed quietly, scripture passages passing from their lips into the cold night air. In the early hours of December 15th, 1944, the German artillery opened fire. The barrage was intense, shells screaming overhead to explode among the American positions. Under normal circumstances, this would have been the prelude to an infantry assault designed to exploit the confusion and terror caused by the bombardment. But the Buffalo Soldiers had been prepared. Many were in reinforced bunkers or had vacated the positions that German observers had identified. The artillery did cause casualties, but far fewer than the Germans had anticipated. When the barrage lifted, German infantry began to advance through the pre-dawn darkness, moving quickly to exploit what they believed would be chaos in the American lines. At first, they encountered minimal resistance, exactly as their intelligence had predicted. Small groups of American soldiers appeared to be retreating in disarray. The German commanders, watching through binoculars, exchanged satisfied glances. The Negro troops were performing exactly as expected, breaking under pressure and abandoning their positions. General Major Rutherford, receiving the initial reports, ordered the second phase of the attack to commence. Reserve units were committed, heavy weapons brought forward, and the tempo of the advance increased. The breakthrough appeared to be developing exactly as planned, with minimal German casualties and significant ground gained. The weather, despite the snow, seemed to be cooperating as well, with visibility improving as dawn approached. It was at this precise moment, with German forces committed and advancing rapidly through what they thought was a collapsing American line, that Captain Hartford gave the order. Flares shot into the sky, bathing the landscape in harsh red light. Then, from concealed positions on the flanks, American machine guns opened fire. Artillery that had remained silent during the initial German bombardment now unleashed precise, devastating fire on pre-registered coordinates. The seemingly retreating American soldiers suddenly turned and took up defensive positions, their withdrawal revealed as a tactical feint. The German advance, caught in the open and suddenly under fire from three sides, stalled immediately. The carefully planned breakthrough had become a carefully planned ambush. What followed was nothing short of slaughter. German soldiers, exposed on the snow-covered slopes, found themselves with nowhere to hide. Attempts to retreat were met with artillery fire on their assembly areas and supply lines. Forward units, now cut off from support, fought desperately but were gradually eliminated. By mid-morning it was over. The field was littered with German dead and wounded. Those who could surrender did so, many in a state of shock, not just at the defeat, but at who had defeated them. Captured officers, brought to the American command post for interrogation, could barely conceal their disbelief when confronted with the black officers and non-commissioned officers who had orchestrated their downfall. General Major Rutherford, who had narrowly escaped capture, was forced to report a catastrophic failure to his superiors. His explanation, that the Negro troops had demonstrated unexpected tactical sophistication and fighting determination, was met with skepticism bordering on disbelief. Unable to accept that their racial theories had been so thoroughly disproven on the battlefield, German High Command instead chose to believe that the operation had been compromised by espionage or betrayal. In the American lines, the Buffalo soldiers took stock of their victory. They had suffered casualties, yes, but far fewer than they had inflicted. More importantly, they had completely disrupted the German offensive capabilities in this sector. The anticipated German breakthrough had not only failed, but had resulted in the destruction of elite enemy units that could not be easily replaced. Captain Hartford received a radio call from division headquarters. General Ormond wanted a full report on the engagement, including an explanation for why Hartford had deviated from standard defensive protocols. The implication was clear. Despite the victory, the black officers and men would still need to justify their actions and decisions in a way that white units would not. Lieutenant Thompson, overhearing the radio exchange, shook his head in resignation. "Some things never change, do they, sir? We win their battle for them, and they still question how we did it." Hartford didn't respond immediately. He was watching medics treat a wounded German officer who kept staring at the black soldiers around him with a mixture of confusion and dawning comprehension. Finally, the captain turned to his lieutenant with a tired smile. "One battle at a time, Thompson. One battle at a time." In the days that followed, word of the engagement spread along the front lines. White soldiers from neighboring units came to see for themselves the field where the Buffalo soldiers had destroyed a German offensive before it could begin. Many were openly admiring, shaking hands and sharing cigarettes with men they might have ignored or disdained just days earlier. Others remained skeptical, suggesting that the victory had been exaggerated or was somehow a fluke. What could not be denied was the strategic impact. The German forces in that sector, having lost significant manpower and material in the failed offensive, were forced to retreat to more defensible positions. This created opportunities that Allied command was quick to exploit, leading to advances across a broad front. The official reports credited these gains to aggressive patrolling and enemy disorganization, rather than explicitly acknowledging the role played by the 92nd Division's trap. 1 week after the battle, a correspondent from the Baltimore Afro-American newspaper arrived at the regiment's position, having heard rumors of the engagement. Sergeant Washington showed him the battlefield, still littered with abandoned German equipment despite efforts to clear the area. The correspondent took photographs and detailed notes, promising to tell the true story to readers back home. But his article, when finally published, was heavily censored by military authorities, with all specific references to the tactics employed by the Buffalo soldiers removed. Meanwhile, in a field hospital 20 miles behind the front line, a German prisoner named Kurt Schmidt was recovering from wounds sustained during the battle. A former university student before being drafted into the Wehrmacht, Schmidt spoke excellent English and had been identified by intelligence officers as a potential source of information. Lieutenant Baldwin was assigned to interview him, their conversations initially focusing on German troop dispositions and morale. On the third day of interviews, Schmidt unexpectedly asked a question of his own. "The Negro soldiers who captured me, they were not what we had been told to expect. They were disciplined, efficient. They treated prisoners correctly, according to the Geneva Convention. This contradicts everything our officers said." Baldwin studied the German's face for a moment before responding. "And what exactly did your officers tell you about Negro soldiers?" Schmidt looked uncomfortable. That they were primitive, undisciplined, that they would break under pressure and could not execute complex military operations. That they were, he hesitated, inferior. Baldwin's expression remained neutral, though his hand tightened slightly around his pencil. "And now? What do you think now?" The German was silent for a long moment. "I think," he finally said, "that much of what I was taught about race is questionable at best, perhaps even deliberately false." This conversation, dutifully recorded in Baldwin's report, was filed away and eventually classified. It would remain inaccessible to historians and the public for more than 2 decades. In February 1945, Captain Hartford received orders transferring him and several other officers from the 92nd Division to new assignments. The official explanation was redistribution of experienced personnel, but Hartford suspected the real reason was more complex. Their success had created a narrative problem. Black officers leading black troops to a significant victory didn't fit neatly into the military's preferred vision of the war or its heroes. Before leaving, Hartford met one last time with his officers in the same farmhouse where they had planned their ambush 2 months earlier. The mood was somber, tinged with the bitter understanding that their accomplishment would likely go unrecognized in the official histories of the war. "I've requested commendations for each of you and for the men," Hartford told them. "I don't know if they'll be approved, but I want you to know that what we did here matters, whether they acknowledge it or not. Someday, the full story will be told." Lieutenant Thompson managed a smile. "Maybe in 50 years or so, when nobody cares anymore." "Perhaps sooner than that," Hartford replied. "The world is changing. It has to. As winter gave way to spring, the Allied advance continued across Italy. The men of the 92nd Division fought in numerous engagements, adding to their record of service despite continuing skepticism from some quarters of the military establishment. By the time Germany surrendered in May 1945, the Buffalo Soldiers had proven themselves many times over, though full recognition of their contributions would indeed take decades. During those years, in the immediate aftermath of the war, the story of how a regiment of black soldiers had outthought and outfought an elite German unit in the mountains of Italy was relegated to personal memories and private conversations. Official histories mentioned the action only in passing, if at all. Medals and commendations were sparse compared to those awarded for similar achievements by white units. Most of the participants returned to civilian life, facing the contradictions of a nation that had needed their service abroad while maintaining systems of segregation and discrimination at home. Many chose not to speak about their wartime experiences, finding that civilians either didn't believe their stories or weren't interested in hearing them. In 1958, 14 years after the battle, a historian named Dr. Eleanor Worthington began researching the combat record of African American units in World War II. Her interest was initially academic. She was preparing a dissertation on the evolution of military integration policies. But as she delved into available records and conducted interviews with veterans, she became increasingly convinced that significant aspects of the Buffalo Soldiers' service had been deliberately obscured. Dr. Worthington's breakthrough came when she discovered a cache of personal papers belonging to a former staff officer at 5th Army Headquarters. Among them was a folder containing reports that had never been incorporated into the official record, including several pertaining to the actions of the 370th Regiment in December 1944. These documents provided the first written confirmation of what veterans had been claiming for years, that the regiment had not merely repelled a German attack, but had deliberately drawn the enemy into a meticulously planned trap. Armed with this information, Worthington expanded her research, tracking down former members of the regiment as well as German prisoners who had been captured during the engagement. Many were reluctant to speak at first, conditioned by years of official indifference, but gradually a more complete picture emerged. The battle, she discovered, had been far more significant than previously acknowledged. The German units involved had included elements of the 16th SS Panzer Grenadier Division, considered among the most fanatical and effective of Nazi formations. Their complete defeat by the Buffalo Soldiers had not only prevented a potential breakthrough, but had substantially weakened German defensive capabilities along that entire sector of the front. More disturbing were the indications of how thoroughly the story had been suppressed. Documents had been classified, reports amended, and in some cases, participants reassigned to distant theaters to prevent them from speaking too freely about their experiences. The victory had been incompatible with prevailing attitudes about the capabilities of black soldiers, and so it had been effectively written out of history. In 1960, Dr. Worthington published her findings in a scholarly journal. The article, titled "Erased Victory, the Buffalo Soldiers and the Winter Counteroffensive of 1944, generated little public interest, but sent shockwaves through military historical circles. Veterans Affairs offices began receiving inquiries from former members of the 92nd Division, asking why their service had been so thoroughly minimized. The following year, a journalist named Martin Crawford picked up the story for a major magazine. His article, more accessible to the general public than Worthington's academic paper, included interviews with surviving officers and enlisted men from the regiment. It also featured a statement from the Department of Defense acknowledging that certain battlefield accomplishments of segregated units may have been inadequately documented due to the organizational practices of the period. This careful bureaucratic admission was far from the full recognition the veterans deserved, but it was a start. More importantly, it opened the door for additional research and a gradual reassessment of the Buffalo Soldiers' contributions to the Allied victory in Europe. In 1963, former Lieutenant Marcus Baldwin, by then a professor of history at Howard University, organized a reunion of surviving members of the 370th Regiment. More than 200 veterans attended, many meeting for the first time since the war. During the three-day event, they shared stories, compared recollections, and collectively constructed a more complete narrative of their service than had ever been assembled before. One of the most emotional moments came when Baldwin presented a series of photographs that had never been published. Taken by an army photographer who had been with the regiment during the battle, they showed the aftermath of the engagement. German prisoners being processed, abandoned enemy equipment in the snow, and Buffalo soldiers standing victorious on ground they had defended against overwhelming odds. For many veterans, these images were the first tangible proof they had seen of an achievement that had been denied official recognition for nearly 20 years. The reunion concluded with the establishment of the Buffalo Soldiers' Historical Foundation, dedicated to preserving and promoting the legacy of African American military service. Its first project was the collection and archiving of first-hand accounts from veterans of the 92nd Division, creating a repository of information that would prove invaluable to future historians. As the civil rights movement gathered momentum throughout the 1960s, interest in the Buffalo Soldiers' story grew. Their experience exemplified the fundamental contradiction at the heart of America's war effort, fighting against fascism and racism abroad while maintaining systems of segregation and discrimination at home. Veterans who had remained silent for decades began speaking publicly about both their service and the lack of recognition that had followed. In 1968, a congressional subcommittee was formed to investigate allegations of systematic underreporting of achievements by African American units during World War II. The hearings, televised nationally, featured testimony from veterans, historians, and military officials. While the proceedings were often contentious, they brought unprecedented attention to the contributions of black soldiers, including the men of the 92nd Division. The subcommittee's final report, released in 1969, acknowledged significant and systemic failures to properly recognize the accomplishments of Negro units. It recommended a comprehensive review of service records with the aim of correcting historical oversights and ensuring appropriate recognition for veterans whose achievements had been minimized or ignored. This process, slow and often bureaucratically cumbersome, would eventually result in the awarding of previously denied medals and commendations to numerous veterans of the Buffalo Soldiers. But for many, the recognition came too late. By the time the review was completed in the late 1970s, a significant number of the men who had fought in the mountains of Italy had already passed away, their service acknowledged only posthumously. The full story of how the Buffalo Soldiers had outmaneuvered both the German SS and the prejudices of their own military establishment would continue to evolve as additional records were declassified and more comprehensive histories were written. Books, documentaries, and eventually digital archives ensured that what had once been deliberately obscured would become an indelible part of America's military history. In 2001, historians at the U.S. Army Center of Military History completed a comprehensive reassessment of the 92nd Division's combat record. Their report confirmed what veterans and independent researchers had long maintained, that the division's achievements had been consistently underreported and undervalued due to racial prejudice. The report specifically highlighted the December 1944 engagement as a tactical masterpiece that demonstrated exceptional planning, discipline, and courage under fire. For the few surviving veterans who lived to see this official vindication, It represented the closing of a circle that had remained open for more than half a century. Their victory, first on the battlefield and then against the forces of historical erasure, was finally complete. The German generals, who had laughed at the prospect of facing black soldiers only to see their front line vanish overnight, would surely have been surprised by this outcome as well. Today, the story of the Buffalo Soldiers serves as both a testament to extraordinary courage in combat and a reminder of the long struggle for equality that continued long after the guns of World War II fell silent. Their experience embodies an essential truth about America's journey, that the nation's highest ideals have often been most fully embodied by those to whom the fullest rights of citizenship were denied. In proving themselves on the battlefield, the Buffalo Soldiers were fighting not just for victory over fascism abroad, but for the promise of democracy at home, a promise that, like historical truth itself, has required constant vigilance to defend and fulfill. During decades, the archive's military maintained this story in total sigillo. No soldier who participated wanted to speak about what really happened that night in Italy. But now you know the reason. Help us take this story to more people. Like the video, comment if you already knew this case, and subscribe to the channel. I'll see you in the next episode.